history video. It's been a while, it has been a little while. But I thought with the recent release of Ridley Scott's latest movie, Napoleon, I thought we could take a look at Napoleon, funnily enough. Because there's a little bit of controversy surrounding the movie about there being inclusions of certain things that aren't deemed historically accurate. So, I mean, I haven't seen the movie yet. I think by the time this comes out, I hopefully will have, because I plan on seeing it this weekend. But you have to let me know if it's any good. I was going to say no spoilers, but it's technically history, so technically this video will probably be spoilers for stuff that happens in the movie. But yeah, hopefully it should be a good time, relaxing and informative, as always is the aim here on the channel. So without further ado, let's get into the life of Napoleon. So Napoleon I was a French general, first consul and emperor of the French. He's one of the most celebrated personages in the history of the West. He revolutionized military organization and training, sponsored the Napoleonic Code, the prototype of later civil law codes, reorganized education, and established the long-lived concordat with the papacy. Napoleon's many reforms left a lasting mark on the institutions of France and of much of Western Europe, but his driving passion was the military expansion of French dominion. And though at his fall he left France a little larger than it had been at the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789, he was almost unanimously revered during his lifetime, and until the end of the Second Empire under his nephew Napoleon III, as one of history's great heroes. So, we'll begin with his early life and education. Napoleon was born on Corsica shortly after the island's cession to France by the Genoese. He was the fourth and second surviving child of Carlo Buonaparte, a lawyer, and his wife, Letizia Romolino. His father's family of ancient Tuscan nobility had emigrated to Corsica in the 16th century. Carlo Buonaparte had married the beautiful and strong-willed Letizia when she was only 14 years old. Yikes. They eventually had 8 children to bring up in very difficult times. The French occupation of their native country was resisted by a number of Corsicans led by Pascal Paoli. Carlo Bonaparte joined Paoli's party, but when Paoli had to flee, Bonaparte came to terms with the French, winning the protection of the governor of Corsica. He was appointed assessor for the judicial district of Ajaccio in 1771. In 1778, he obtained the admission of his 2 eldest sons, Joseph and Napoleon, to the Collège d'Autun. A Corsican by birth, heredity and childhood associations, Napoleon continued for some time after his arrival in continental France to regard himself as a foreigner. Yet from age 9 he was educated in France as other Frenchmen were. While the tendency to see in Napoleon a reincarnation of some 14th century Italian condottiere is an overemphasis on one aspect of his character, he did in fact share neither the traditions nor the prejudices of his new country. Remaining a Corsican in temperament, he was first and foremost, through both his education and his reading, a man of the 18th century. Napoleon was educated at 3 schools, briefly at Autun, for 5 years at the Military College of Brienne, and finally for 1 year at the Military Academy in Paris. It was during Napoleon's year in Paris that his father died of stomach cancer in February 1785. family in straitened circumstances. Napoleon, although not the eldest son, assumed the position of head of the family before he was 16. In September he graduated from the military academy, ranking 42nd in a class of 58. He was made second lieutenant of artillery in the regiment of La Fère, a kind of training school for young artillery officers. Garrisoned at Valence, Napoleon continued his education, reading much, in particular works on strategy and tactics. He also wrote Lettres sur la Corse, or Letters on Corsica, in which he reveals his feeling for his native island. He went back to Corsica in September 1786 and did not rejoin his regiment until June 1788. By that time the agitation that was to culminate in the French Revolution had already begun. A reader of Voltaire and of Rousseau, Napoleon believed that a political change was imperative, but as a career officer, he seems not to have seen any need for radical social reforms. So, we move into the revolutionary period, beginning with the Jacobin years. When in 1789 the National Assembly, which had convened to establish a constitutional monarchy, allowed Paoli to return to Corsica, Napoleon asked to leave and in September joined Paoli's group. But Paoli had no sympathy for the young man. I realise I keep changing the way I'm pronouncing these names, I apologise. And Paoli had no sympathy for the young man, whose father had deserted his cause and whom he considered to be a foreigner. Disappointed, Napoleon returned to France, and in April 1791 he was appointed first lieutenant to the 4th Regiment of Artillery, garrisoned at Valence. He at once joined the Jacobin Club, a debating society initially favouring a constitutional monarchy, and soon became its president, making speeches against nobles, monks and bishops. In September 1791, he got leave to go back to Corsica again for 3 months. Elected lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, he soon fell out with Paoli, its commander-in-chief. When he failed to return to France, he was listed as a deserter in January 1792. But in April, France declared war against Austria, and his offence was forgiven. Apparently through patronage, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of captain, but did not rejoin his regiment. Instead he returned to Corsica in October 1792, where Paoli was exercising dictatorial powers and preparing to separate Corsica from France. Napoleon, however, joined the Corsican Jacobins, who opposed Paoli's policy. When civil war broke out in Corsica in April 1793, Paoli had the Bonaparte family condemned to perpetual execration and infamy, whereupon they all fled to France. Napoleon Bonaparte, as he may henceforth be called, rejoined his regiment at Nice in June 1793. In his Les Super de Bouquet, written at this time, he argued vigorously for united action by all Republicans, rallied round the Jacobins, who were becoming progressively more radical, and the National Convention, the revolutionary assembly that in the preceding fall had abolished the monarchy. At the end of August 1793, the National Convention's troops had taken Marseille, but were halted before Toulon, where the Royalists had called in British forces. With the commander of the National Convention's artillery wounded, Bonaparte got the post through the commissioner to the army, Antoine Salicetti, who was a Corsican deputy and a friend of Napoleon's family. Bonaparte was promoted to major in September and adjutant received a bayonet wound on December 16th, but on the next day the British troops, harassed by his artillery, evacuated Toulon. On December 22nd, Bonaparte, aged 24, was promoted to Brigadier General in recognition of his decisive part in the capture of the town. Augustin de Robespierre, the commissioner to the army, wrote to his brother Maximilian, by then virtual head of the government and one of the leading figures of the Reign of Terror, praising the transcendent merit of the young Republican officer. In February 1794, Bonaparte was appointed commandant of the artillery in the French army of Italy. Robespierre fell from power in Paris on 9 Thermidor, year 2, on July 27, 1794. When the news reached Nice, Bonaparte, regarded as a protege of Robespierre, was arrested on a charge of conspiracy and treason. He was freed in September but was not restored to his command. The following March he refused an offer to command the military in the Army of the West, which was fighting the counter-revolution in the Vendée. The post seemed to hold no future for him, and he went to Paris to justify himself. Life was difficult on half-pay, especially as he was carrying on an affair with Désirée Clary, daughter of a rich Marseille businessman and sister of Julie, the bride of his elder brother, Joseph. Despite his efforts in Paris, Napoleon was unable to obtain a satisfactory command, because he was feared for his intense ambition and for his relations with the Montagnards, the more radical members of the National Convention. He then considered offering his services to the Sultan of Turkey. So moving into the next section titled The Directory of Napoleon I. Bonaparte was still in Paris in October 1795, when the National Convention, on the eve of its dispersal, submitted the new constitution of the year 3 of the First Republic to a referendum, together with decrees according to which 2/3 of the members of the National Convention were to be re-elected to the new legislative assemblies. The Royalists, hoping that they would soon be able to restore the monarchy, instigated a revolt in Paris to prevent those measures from being put into effect. Paul Barras, who had been entrusted with dictatorial powers by the National Convention, was unwilling to rely on the commander of the troops of the interior. Instead, knowing of Bonaparte's services at Toulon, he appointed him second in command. Thus it was Napoleon who shot down the columns of rebels marching against the National Convention, thereby saving the National Convention and the Republic. Bonaparte became commander of the Army of the Interior and consequently was henceforth aware of every political development in France. He became the respected advisor on military matters to the new government, the Directory. Also at this time, he came to know an attractive Creole, Josephine Tascher de la Pacheret, who was the widow of General Alexandre de Beauharnais, who was guillotined during the Reign of Terror, the mother of 2 children and a woman of many love affairs. From every point of view, a new life was opening for Bonaparte. Having proved his loyalty to the Directory, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Italy in March 1796. He had been trying to obtain that post for several weeks so that he could personally conduct part of the plan of campaign adopted by the Directory on his advice. He married Josephine on March 9th and left for the army 2 days later. Arriving at his headquarters in Nice, Bonaparte found that his army, which on provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honour, glory, wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness? So, next is the Battle of Lodi. He took the offensive on April 12th and successively defeated and separated the Austrian and the Sardinian armies and then marched on Turin. King Victor Amadeus III of Sardinia asked for an armistice, and at the peace treaty in Paris on May 15th, Nice and Savoy, occupied by the French since 1792, were annexed to France. Bonaparte continued the war against the Austrians and occupied Milan, but was held up at Mantua. While his army was besieging this great fortress, he signed armistices with the Duke of Parma, with the Duke of Modena, and finally with Pope Pius VI. At the same time, he took an interest in the political organisation of Italy. A plan for its republicanization by a group of Italian patriots, led by Filippo Buonarroti, had to be shelved when Buonarroti was arrested for complicity in Francois Noël Babeuf's conspiracy against the Directory. Thereafter, Bonaparte, without discarding the Italian patriots altogether, restricted their freedom of action. He set up a republican regime in Lombardy, but kept a close watch on its leaders, and in October 1796 he created the Cisalpine Republic by merging Modena and Reggio nell'Emilia with the papal states of Bologna and Ferrara occupied by the French army. Then he sent an expedition to recover Corsica, which the British had now evacuated. Austrian armies advanced 4 times from the Alps to relieve Mantua, but were defeated each time by Bonaparte. After the last Austrian defeat, at Rivoli in January 1797, Mantua capitulated. Next, he marched on Vienna. He was about 60 miles from that capital when the Austrians sued for an armistice. By the preliminaries of peace, Austria ceded the southern Netherlands to France and recognised the Lombard Republic, but received in exchange some territory belonging to the old Republic of Venice, which was partitioned between Austria, France and Lombardy. Bonaparte then consolidated and reorganised the northern Italian republics and encouraged Jacobin propaganda in Venetia. Some Italian patriots hoped that these developments would soon lead to the formation of a single and indivisible Italian republic modelled on the French. Meanwhile, Bonaparte grew uneasy at the successes of the Royalists in the French elections in the spring of 1797 and advised the Directory to oppose them, if necessary by force. He sent General Pierre Augereau to Paris, along with several officers and men, to back the coup d'état of 18 Fructidor, year 5, which eliminated the Royalist Friends from the government and legislative councils, and also enhanced Bonaparte's prestige. Thus Bonaparte could conclude the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria as he thought best. The Directory was displeased, however, because the treaty ceded Venice to the Austrians and did not secure the left bank of the Rhine for France. On the other hand, it raised Bonaparte's popularity to its peak, for he had gained victory for France after 5 years of war on the continent. Only the war at sea against the British continued. The directors who wanted to launch an invasion of the British Isles appointed Bonaparte to command the army assembled for this purpose along the English Channel. After a rapid inspection in February 1798, he announced that the operation could not be undertaken until France had command of the sea. Instead, he suggested that France strike at the sources of Great Britain's wealth by occupying Egypt and threatening the route to India. This proposal, seconded by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the foreign minister, was accepted by the directors, who were glad to get rid of their ambitious young general. The expedition, thanks to some fortunate coincidences, was at first a great success. Malta, the great fortress of the Hospitallers, was occupied on June 10, 1798. Alexandria taken by storm on July 1st, and all of the delta of the Nile rapidly overrun. On August the 1st, however, the French squadron at anchor in Abu Qir Bay was completely destroyed by Admiral Horatio Nelson's fleet in the Battle of the Nile, so that Napoleon found himself confined to the land that he had conquered. He proceeded to introduce Western political institutions, administration, and technical skills in Egypt, but Turkey, nominally suzerain over Egypt, declared war on France in September. To prevent a Turkish invasion of Egypt, and also perhaps to attempt to return to France by way of Anatolia, Bonaparte marched into Syria in February 1799. His progress northward was halted at Acre, where the British withstood a siege, and in May, Bonaparte began a disastrous retreat to Egypt. The Battle of the Nile showed Europe that Bonaparte was not invincible, and Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Turkey formed a new coalition against France. The French armies in Italy were defeated in the spring of 1799 and had to abandon the greater part of the peninsula. These defeats led to disturbances in France itself. The coup d'etat of 30 Prairial, Year 7, or June 18, 1799, expelled the men of moderate views from the Directory and brought into it men who were considered Jacobins. Yet the situation remained confused, and one of the new directors, Emmanuel Sayers, was convinced that only military dictatorship could prevent a restoration of the monarchy. Bonaparte did not take long to make up his mind. He would leave his army and return to France in order to save the Republic, of course, but also to take advantage of the new circumstances and to seize power. The Directory had in fact ordered his return, but he had not received the order, so that it was actually in disregard of his instructions that he left Egypt with a few companions on August 22nd, 1799. Their two frigates surprisingly escaped interception by the British, and Bonaparte arrived in Paris on October 14th. By this time, French victories in Switzerland and Holland had averted the danger of invasion, and the counter-revolutionary risings within France had more or less failed. A coup d'etat could therefore no longer be justified by any need to save the Republic. Sayers, however, had not given up his project. From the end of October, he and Bonaparte were in league together planning the coup, and on 18th to 19th Brumaire, Year 8, it was carried out. The directors were forced to resign, the members of the legislative councils were dispersed, and a new government, the consulate, was set up. The three consuls were Bonaparte and two of the directors who had resigned, Sieyès and Pierre Roger Ducos. But it was Bonaparte who was henceforth the master of France. So the next section is titled The Consulate, and we begin with Napoleon's consolidation of power. Bonaparte, now 30 years old, was thin and short and wore his hair cut close, le petit tondu, or the little crop head, as he was called. Not much was known about his personality, but people consolidate the political and social conquests of the revolution. He was indeed exceptionally intelligent, prompt to make decisions, and hard-working, but also insatiably ambitious. He seemed to be the man of the revolution because it was due to the revolution that he had climbed at so early an age to the highest place in the state. He was not to forget it, but more than a man of the revolution, he was a man of the 18th century, the most enlightened of the enlightened despots, a true son of Voltaire. He did not believe in the sovereignty of the people, in the popular will or in a parliamentary debate, yet he put his confidence more in reasoning than in reason, and may be said to have preferred men of talent, mathematicians, jurists, and statesmen, for instance, to technicians in the true sense of the word. He believed that an enlightened and firm will could do anything if it had the support of bayonets. He despised and feared the masses, and as for public opinion, he considered that he could mould and direct it as he pleased. He has been called the most civilian of generals, but essentially he never ceased to be a soldier. Bonaparte imposed a dictatorship on France, but its true character was at first disguised by the Constitution of the year 8, drawn up by Sieyès. This constitution did not guarantee the rights of man or make any mention of liberty, equality and fraternity, but it did reassure the partisans of the revolution by proclaiming the irrevocability of the sale of national property and by upholding the legislation against the émigrés. It gave immense powers to the first consul, leaving only a nominal role for his two colleagues. The first consul, namely Bonaparte, was to appoint ministers, generals, civil servants, magistrates, and the members of the Council of State, and even was to have an overwhelming influence in the choice of members for the three legislative assemblies, though their members were theoretically to be chosen by universal suffrage. Submitted to a plebiscite, the constitution won by an overwhelming majority in February 1800. So moving on to programme of reforms. The consulate's work of administrative reform, undertaken at Bonaparte's instigation, was to be more lasting than the constitution and so more important for France. At the head of the government was the Council of State, created by the first consul and often effectively presided over by him. It was to play an important part both as the source of the new legislation and as an administrative tribunal. At the head of the administration of the départements were the prefects, who carried on the tradition of the intendants of the ancient regime, supervising the application of the laws and acting as the instruments of centralization. The judicial system was profoundly changed. Whereas from the beginning of the revolution judges had been elected, henceforth they were to be nominated by the government, their independence assured by their irremovability from office. The police organisation was greatly strengthened. The financial administration was considerably improved. Instead of the municipalities, special officials were entrusted with the collecting of direct taxes. The franc was stabilised, and the Banque de France, owned partly by shareholders and partly by the state, was created. Education was transformed into a major public service. Secondary education was given a semi-military organisation, and the university faculties were re-established. Primary education, however, was still neglected. Bonaparte shared Voltaire's belief that the people needed a religion. Personally, he was indifferent to religion. In Egypt, he had said that he wanted to become a Muslim, yet he considered that religious peace had to be restored to France. As early as 1796, when he was concluding the armistice in Italy with Pope Pius VI, he Pius VII, who succeeded Pius VI in March 1800, was more accommodating than his predecessor, and 10 months after negotiations were opened, the Concordat of 1801 was signed, reconciling the Church and the Revolution. The Pope recognised the French Republic and called for the resignation of all former bishops. New prelates were to be designated by the first consul and instituted by the Pope, and the sale of the property of the clergy was officially recognised by Rome. The Concordat, in fact, admitted freedom of worship and the lay character of the state. The codification of the civil law, first undertaken in 1790, was at last completed under the consulate. The code, promulgated on 21st of March 1804, and later known as the Napoleonic Code, gave permanent form to the great gains of the Revolution: individual liberty, freedom of work, freedom of conscience, the lay character of the state, and equality before the law. But at the same time, it protected landed property, gave greater liberty to employers, and showed little concern for employees. It maintained divorce but granted only limited legal rights to women. The army received the most careful attention. The first consul retained in outline the system instituted by the Revolution: recruitment by forced conscription but with the possibility of replacement by substitutes, the mixing of the conscripts with old soldiers, and the eligibility of all for promotion to the highest ranks. Nevertheless, the creation of the Academy of Saint Cyr to produce infantry officers made it easier for the sons of bourgeois families to pursue a military career. Moreover, the École Polytechnique, founded by the National Convention, was militarized in order to provide officers for the artillery and engineers. Yet Bonaparte was not concerned about introducing new technical inventions into his army. He put his trust in the legs of the soldiers. His basic strategic idea was a fast-moving army. So the next subsection is titled Military Campaigns and Uneasy Peace. The first consul spent the winter and spring of 1799 to 1800 reorganizing the army and preparing for an attack on Austria alone, Russia having withdrawn from the anti-French coalition. With his usual quick assessment of the situation, he saw the strategic importance of the Swiss Confederation, from which he would be free to outflank the Austrian armies either in Germany or in Italy, as he might see fit. His past successes made him choose Italy, taking his army across the Great St. Bernard Pass before the snow melted. He appeared unexpectedly behind the Austrian army besieging Genoa. The Battle of Marengo in June gave the French command of the Po Valley as far as the Adige, and in December another French army defeated the Austrians in Germany. Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Lunéville of February 1801, whereby France's right to the natural frontiers that Julius Caesar had given to Gaul, namely the Rhine, the Alps and the Pyrenees, was recognised. Great Britain alone remained at war with France, but it soon tired of the struggle. Preliminaries of peace concluded in London on October 1801 put an end to hostilities, and peace was signed at Amiens on March 27, 1802. General peace was re-established in Europe. The first consul's prestige increased still more, and his friends proposed that a token of national gratitude should be offered to him. In May 1802, it was decided that the French people should vote in referendum on the following question: shall Napoleon Bonaparte be consul for life his successor. Bonaparte's conception of international peace differed from that of the British, for whom the Treaty of Amiens represented an absolute limit, beyond which they were under no circumstances prepared to go. The British even hoped to take back some of the concessions they had been forced to make. For Bonaparte, on the other hand, the Treaty of Amiens marked the starting point for a new French ascendancy. He was, first of all, intent on reserving half of Europe as a market for France without lowering customs duties, to the indignation of British merchants. To revive France's expansion overseas, he also intended to recover Saint Dominique, to occupy Louisiana, perhaps to reconquer Egypt, and at any rate to extend French influence in the Mediterranean and in the Indian Ocean. In continental Europe he advanced beyond France's natural frontiers, incorporating Piedmont into France, imposing a more centralised government on the Swiss Confederation, and in Germany compensating the princes dispossessed of territory on the Rhine under the Treaty of Lunéville, with shares of the secularised ecclesiastical states. Great Britain was alarmed by this expansion of France in peacetime and found it scarcely tolerable that one state should command the coastline of the continent from Genoa to Antwerp. The immediate occasion of Franco-British rupture, however, was the problem of Malta. According to the Treaty of Amiens, the British who had taken the island on the collapse of the French occupation should have restored it to the Hospitallers, but the British, on the pretext that the French had not yet evacuated certain Neapolitan ports, refused to leave the island. Franco-British relations became strained, and in May 1803, the British declared war. Now we move on to the next section. It is a new day for me. I had to stop filming yesterday, but we carry on today. So this next section is titled The Empire. So the peace settlement had brought about the life consulate. The return of war was to stimulate the formation of the empire. The British government, which would have been glad to see Bonaparte deposed or removed by assassination, renewed its subsidies to the French royalists, who resumed their agitation and plotting. When a British-financed assassination plot was uncovered in 1804, Bonaparte decided to react vigorously enough to deter his opponents from any more such attempts. The police believed that the real head of the conspiracy was the young Duc d'Enghien, a scion of the royal house of Bourbon, who was residing in Germany a few miles across the frontier. Accordingly, with the agreement of Talleyrand and the police chief Joseph Fouché, the Duke was kidnapped on neutral soil and brought to Vincennes, where he was tried and shot. This action provoked a resurgence of opposition among the old aristocracy, but enhanced the influence of Fouché. So founding the empire. In the hope of consolidating his own position, Fouché now suggested to Bonaparte that the best way to discourage conspiracy would be to transform the life consulate into a hereditary empire, which, because of the fact there would be an heir, would remove all hope of changing the regime by assassination. Bonaparte readily accepted the suggestion, and on May 18, 1804, the empire was proclaimed. Though there was little change in the organisation of the government of France, Napoleon as emperor revived a number of institutions similar to those of the ancient regime. In the first place, he wanted to be consecrated by the Pope himself, so that his coronation should be even more impressive than that of kings of France. Pius VII agreed to come to Paris, and the ceremony, which seemed equally outrageous to royalists and to the old soldiers of the Revolution, it took place in Notre Dame on December 2nd, 1804. so, the problem was the same as in 1798. To cross the Channel, the French had to have control of the sea. Still far inferior to the British Navy, the French fleet needed the help of the Spanish, and even then the two fleets together could not hope to defeat more than one of the British squadrons. Spain was induced to declare war on Great Britain in December 1804, and it was decided that French and Spanish squadrons massed in the Antilles should lure a British squadron into these waters and defeat it, thus making the balance roughly equal between the Franco-Spanish Navy and the British. A battle in the entrance to the Channel could then be fought with some chance of success. But the plan failed. The French squadron from the Mediterranean, under Admiral Pierre de Villeneuve, found itself alone at the appointed meeting place in Antille. Pursued by Nelson and not daring to attack him, it turned back toward Europe and took refuge in Cadiz in July 1805. There the British blockaded it. Accused of cowardice by Napoleon, Villeneuve resolved to run the blockade with the support of a Spanish squadron, but on October 22, 1805, he was attacked by Nelson off Cape Trafalgar. Nelson was killed in the battle, but the Franco-Spanish fleet was totally destroyed. The British had won a decisive victory, which eliminated the danger of invasion and gave them freedom of movement at sea. The British had also succeeded in organising a new anti-French coalition consisting of Austria, Russia, Sweden and Naples. On July 24th, 1805, 3 months before Trafalgar, Napoleon had ordered the Grand Army from Boulogne to the Danube. In the week preceding Trafalgar, the Grand Army won an outstanding victory over the Austrians at Ulm, and in November Napoleon entered Vienna. On December 2nd, 1805, in his greatest victory, he defeated the combined Austrian and Russian armies in the Battle of Austerlitz. By the Treaty of Pressburg, Austria renounced all influence in Italy and ceded Venetia and Dalmatia to Napoleon, as well as extensive territory in Germany to his protégés Bavaria, Württemberg and Baden. The French then proceeded to dethrone the Bourbons in the Kingdom of Naples, which was bestowed on Napoleon's brother Joseph. In July 1806, the Confederation of the Rhine was founded, soon to embrace all of Western Germany in a union under French protection. In September 1806, Prussia entered the war against France, and on October 14th the Prussian armies were defeated at Jena and Auerstadt. The Russians put up a better resistance at Eylau in February 1807, but were routed at Friedland in June. In Warsaw, Napoleon fell in love with Countess Marie Waluska, a Polish patriot who hoped that Napoleon would resurrect her country. Napoleon had a son by her. The Russian Emperor Alexander I could have continued the struggle, but he was tired of the alliance with the British. He met Napoleon at Tilsit, in northern Prussia near the Russian frontier. There, on a raft anchored in the middle of the Niemen River, they signed treaties that created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, from the Polish provinces detached from Prussia and, in effect, divided control of Europe between the two emperors, Napoleon taking the west and Alexander the east. Alexander even made a vague promise of a land attack against the British possessions in India. So moving now into blockade and the Peninsular Campaign. As Napoleon could no longer think of invading England, he tried to induce capitulation by stifling the British economy. By closing all of Europe to British merchandise, He hoped to bring about a revolt of the British unemployed that could force the government to sue for peace. He forbade all trade with the British Isles, ordered the confiscation of goods coming from English factories or from British colonies, and condemned as fair price not only every British ship, but also every ship that had touched the coast of England or its colonies. For the blockade to succeed, it had to be enforced rigorously throughout Europe, but from the beginning, England's old ally Portugal showed itself reluctant to comply, for the blockade would mean its commercial ruin. Napoleon decided to break down Portuguese opposition by force. Charles IV of Spain led the French troops across his kingdom, and they occupied Lisbon. But the prolonged presence of Napoleon's soldiers in north of Spain led to insurrection. When Charles abdicated in favour of his son Ferdinand VII, Napoleon, seeing the opportunity to rid Europe of its last Bourbon rulers, summoned the Spanish royal family to Bayonne in April 1808 and obtained the abdication of both Charles and Ferdinand. They were both interned in Talleyrand's chateau. After the bloody suppression of an uprising in Madrid, insurrection spread across the whole country, but the Spaniards would not accept Joseph Bonaparte, King of Naples, as their new king. The subsequent defeat of his forces in Spain and Portugal were sensational blows to Napoleon's prestige. Soon the Iberian Peninsula, up in arms, became a bridgehead on the continent for the British. Under the energetic Arthur Wellesley, later 1st Duke of Wellington, in command from 1809, the Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese forces were to achieve decisive successes. At the Congress of Erfurt, a conference with Alexander I, Napoleon assembled a great concourse of princes to impress the Russian Emperor in an attempt to extract promises of help. Whether impressed or not, Alexander would make no definite commitment. Alexander's refusal, furthermore, was partly prompted by Talleyrand, who had become dismayed by Napoleon's policies and was already negotiating with the Russian Emperor behind his master's back. By early 1809, however, with most of the Grand Army thrown into Spain, Napoleon seemed on the point of overcoming the revolt. Then, in April, Austria launched an attack in Bavaria in the hope of rousing all of Germany against the French. Napoleon once again defeated the Habsburgs, and by the Treaty of Schönbrunn, obtained the Illyrian provinces, thus rounding out the continental system. The next subsection is titled Consolidation of Empire. In 1810, Napoleon's fortunes were at their zenith, despite some failures in Spain and Portugal. He considered himself Charlemagne's heir. He repudiated Josephine, who had not given him a child, so that he could marry Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I. The birth of a son, the King of Rome, in March 1811, seemed to assure the future of his empire, but at its greatest extent, including not only the Illyrian provinces, but also Etruria, some of the Papal states, Holland, and the German states bordering the North Sea. The empire was surrounded by a ring of vassal states, ruled over by the emperor's relatives. The Kingdom of Westphalia was Jerome Bonaparte, the Kingdom of Spain Joseph Bonaparte, the Kingdom of Italy with Eugene de Beauharnais, Josephine's son, and so on and so forth. The political map of Europe, which had been so complicated before 1796, was now greatly simplified. Yet the frontiers did not coincide either with geographic features or with nationalities. Whatever he may later have said, Napoleon was interested in realising either German or Italian unity, yet by reducing the number of states, by pushing the frontiers about, by amalgamating populations and by propagating institutions like those that the revolution and nationalism had created in France, he prepared the ground for German and Italian unification. National feeling in Europe, stirred by French ideas and by contact with Frenchmen, in turn gave rise to the first resistance against French domination. From 1809 onward, Spanish guerrillas supported by British troops were harassing the French, and the Spanish National Cortes, convened at Cadiz by the insurrectionaries in 1812, promulgated a constitution inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution of 1789 and by British institutions. That leads us into disaster in Russia and its aftermath. Since the Congress of Erfurt, the Russian Emperor had shown himself less and less inclined to deal with Napoleon as a trusted partner. In the spring of 1812, therefore, Napoleon massed his forces in Poland to intimidate Alexander. After some last attempts at agreement, in late June, his Grand Army, about 600,000 men, including contingents extorted from Prussia and from Austria, began to cross the Niemen River. The Russians retreated, adopting a scorched earth policy. Napoleon's army did not reach the approaches to Moscow until the beginning of September. The Russian commander-in-chief, Mikhail Kutuzov, engaged it at Borodino on September 7th. The fight was savage, bloody and indecisive, but a week later Napoleon entered Moscow, which the Russians had abandoned. On that same day a huge fire broke out, destroying the greater part of the town. Moreover, Alexander unexpectedly refused to treat with Napoleon. Withdrawal was necessary, and the premature onset of winter made it disastrous. After the difficult crossing of the Berezina River in November, fewer than 10,000 men fit for combat remained with Napoleon's main force. This catastrophe hardened all of the peoples of Europe to defy Napoleon. In Germany, the news unleashed an outbreak of anti-French demonstrations. The Prussian contingents deserted the Grand Army in December and turned against the French. The Austrians also withdrew their troops and adopted an increasingly hostile attitude. And in Italy, the people began to turn their backs on Napoleon. Even in France, signs of discontent with the regime were becoming more frequent. In Paris, a malcontent general, Claude François de Mallet, nearly succeeded in carrying out a coup d'etat after announcing on October 23, 1812, that Napoleon had died in Russia. This incident was a major factor in Napoleon's decision to hasten back to France ahead of the Grand Army. Arriving in Paris on December 18th, he proceeded to stiffen the dictatorship, to raise money by various expedients, and to levy new troops. Thus in 1813, the forces arrayed against France were no longer armies of mercenaries, but those of nations fighting for their freedom, as the French had fought for theirs in 1792 and 93, and the French themselves, for all their courage, had lost their former enthusiasm. The Emperor's ideal of conquest was no longer that of the nation. In May 1813, Napoleon won some successes against the Russians and Prussians at the Battle of Lutzen and Bautzen, but his decimated army needed reinforcements. The armed mediation of Austria induced Napoleon to agree to an armistice, during which a congress was held at Prague. There Austria proposed very favourable conditions: that French Empire was to return to its natural limits. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw and the Confederation of the Rhine were to be dissolved, and Prussia was to return to its frontiers of 1805. Napoleon made the mistake of hesitating too long. The Congress closed on August 10th before his reply arrived, and Austria declared war. The French were even worse off than in the spring. The Allies were gaining new troops every day, as one German contingent after another left Napoleon to go over to the other side. The greatest debacle since Napoleon came to power was the Battle of Leipzig, or Battle of the Nations, in which the Grand Army was torn to shreds. That defeat degenerated fast into collapse. The French armies in Spain had been defeated in June, and by October the British were attacking their defences north of the Pyrenees. In Italy, the Austrians took the offensive, crossed the Adige River, and occupied Romagna. Murat, now openly a traitor to the emperor, who had made him king of Naples, entered into negotiations with the Viennese court. The Dutch and the Belgians demonstrated against Napoleon. So, this feeds into the downfall and abdication of Napoleon. In January 1814, France was being attacked on all its frontiers. The Allies cleverly announced that they were fighting not against the French people, but against Napoleon alone, since in November 1813 he had rejected the terms offered by the Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens. The extraordinary strategic feats achieved by the Emperor during the first 3 months of 1814 with the army of young conscripts were not enough. He could neither defeat the Allies with their overwhelming numerical superiority, nor arouse the majority of the French people from their resentful attitude. The Legislative Assembly and the Senate, formerly so docile, were now asking for peace and for civil and political liberties. By the Treaty of Chaumont of March 1814, Austria, Russia, Prussia and Great Britain bound themselves together for 20 years, undertook not to negotiate separately, and promised to continue the struggle until Napoleon was overthrown. When the Allied armies arrived before Paris on March 30th, Napoleon had moved east to attack their rearguard. The Parisian authorities, no longer overawed by the Emperor, lost no time in treating with the Allies. As president of the provincial government, Talleyrand proclaimed the deposition of the Emperor and, without consulting the French people, began to negotiate with Louis, the 18th maybe, I'm so bad of numerals, the brother of the executed Louis the 16th. Napoleon had only reached Fontainebleau when he heard that Paris had capitulated. Persuaded that further resistance was useless, he finally abdicated on the 6th of April. By the Treaty of Fontainebleau, the Allies granted him the island of Elba as a sovereign principality, an annual income of 2 million francs to be provided by France, and a guard of 400 volunteers. Also, he retained the title of Emperor. After unsuccessfully trying to poison himself, Napoleon spoke his farewell to his old guard, and after a hazardous journey, during which he narrowly escaped assassination, he arrived at Elba on the 4th of May. So then essentially lived on the island of Elba, and eventually was exiled to St. Helena, I believe, but we're going to sort of skip over that bit and conclude with the Napoleonic legend. So Napoleon's force set loose a torrent of hostile books designed to sully his reputation. One of the least violent of these was the pamphlet de Bonaparte, de Bourbon. Here comes the French, you ready for this? Et la nécessité de se rallier à nos princes légitimes pour le bonheur de la France et celui de l'Europe. Oh, the English is here, so I've just, probably offended a whole country for no reason. Translates on Bonaparte and the Bourbons, and the necessity of rallying around our legitimate princes for the safety of France and of Europe. And that was by the Vicomte de Chateaubriand. Great bit of stake, that. A well-known writer of royalist sympathies. But this anti-Napoleonic literature soon died down, while the task of defending Napoleon was taken up. Lord Byron had published his Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte as early as 1814. The German poet Heinrich Heine wrote his ballad Dear Grenadier in 1817. At the same time, the Emperor's most faithful supporters were working toward his rehabilitation, talking about him and distributing reminders of him, including engravings. They idealized his life and began to create the Napoleonic legend. As soon as the Emperor was dead, the legend grew rapidly. Memoirs, notes, and narratives by those who had followed him into exile contributed substantially to it. In 1822, O'Meara in London had his Napoleon in Exile, or A Voice from St. Helena, published, and various other publications were made as well. Thereafter, the number of works in Napoleon's honour increased continually throughout the rest of the 1820s. Neither police action nor prosecutions could prevent books, pictures and objects evoking the imperial saga from multiplying within France. After the July Revolution of 1830, which created the bourgeois monarchy under Louis Philippe, thousands of tricolour flags appeared in windows, and the government had not only to tolerate the growth of the legend, but even to promote it. In 1833, the statue of Napoleon was put back on the top of the column in the Place Vendôme in Paris, and in 1840, the King Saint-Francois, Prince de Joinville, was sent in a warship to fetch the Emperor's remains from St. Helena to the banks of the Seine in accordance with his last wishes. A magnificent funeral was held in Paris in December 1840, and Napoleon's body was conveyed through the Arc de Triomphe in the Place de l'Étoile. I'm butchering all of these pronunciations, I'm so sorry. To entombment under the dome of the Invalides. By the way, I realised I sort of skipped his death. Napoleon died from what physicians believe was stomach cancer, and he had bleeding gastric ulcers. So there you go. He sort of, I think it was provoked by, he was given medicine which had high levels of mercury in. Anyways, moving on. Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, exploited the legend in order to seize power in France. Though his attempts at Strasbourg in 1836 and at Boulogne in 1840 were failures, it was chiefly because of the growth of the legend that he won election to the presidency of the Second Republic with an overwhelming majority in 1848, and was able to carry out the coup d'etat of December 1851 and make himself emperor in 1852. The disastrous end of the Second Empire in 1870 damaged the Napoleonic legend and gave rise to a new anti-Napoleonic literature, best represented by Hippolyte Taine's Origins of Contemporary France. World Wars I and II, however, together with the experience of the 20th century dictatorships, made it possible to judge Napoleon more fairly. Any comparison with Stalin or Hitler, for instance, can only be to Napoleon's advantage. He was tolerant, he released the Jews from the ghettos, and he showed respect for human life. Brought up on the writings of the philosophies of the Enlightenment, he feels like an ogre who sacrificed millions of men to his ambition. Precise calculations show that the Napoleonic Wars of 1800 to 1815 cost France itself about 500,000 casualties. The loss of these young men did not greatly affect the growth of the population, however. The social structure changed little under the First Empire. It remained roughly what the Revolution made it. A great mass of peasants comprising 3/4 of the population, about half of them working owners of their farms or sharecroppers, and the other half with too little land for their own subsistence and hiring themselves out as labourers. Industry, stimulated by the war and the blockade of English goods, made remarkable progress in northern and eastern France, whence exports could be sent to Central Europe, but it declined in the south and west because of the closing of the Med and the Atlantic. The great migrations from rural areas toward industry in the towns began only after 1815. The nobility would probably have declined more swiftly if Napoleon had not restored it, but it could never recover its former privileges. Above all, Napoleon left durable institutions, the granite masses on which modern France has been built up, the administrative system of the prefects, the Banque de France, and the country's financial organisation, the centralised university and the military academies. Napoleon changed the history both of France and the world. And there you have it. Yes, I jumped over a few little bits, but that was a relatively extensive for an ASMR video, I'd say. Look at the life of Napoleon. Definitely a super interesting, sort of controversial, but definitely influential character in history. And yeah, I really hope you did enjoy this. As always, any requests for history videos you'd like to see? There might be some other historical figures we haven't covered yet who are pretty similar to Napoleon. I'd quite like to do a video on what is it, like from the Russian Tsars to the the evolution of the leaders of Russia kind of thing. So look at the various revolutions and stuff, and basically you can go from the Tsars to the likes of Lenin and Stalin. Yeah, will kind of be a little bit of a throwback to A-level or AS-level, I think A-level history that I did. But let me know if you'd like to see that, or just leave your recommendations down below. But my friends, that is going to do it for tonight's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have made it this far,